Brian Teller was a man of few words, Jenna Teller a woman full of secrets, and on one stormy night behind an abandoned gas station, their marriage ended not with a divorce, but with the roar of a truck engine and the sound of bones breaking. Hillside, Texas wasn't the kind of place where crime made the news. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked. Neighbors waved from their porches and gossip traveled faster than the wind. Nestled between flat farmlands and rusting rail tracks, it felt untouched by time. Families passed down homes through generations. People worked simple jobs and led even simpler lives. It was, by all appearances, peaceful. But beneath that stillness, pain sometimes festered in silence. Brian Teller was one of those people everyone in Hillside liked. He ran a small auto repair shop near the edge of town, fixing everything from tractors to old pickups. Customers trusted him because he never overcharged, never made excuses, and always worked with his hands covered in grease and his head down. He wasn't loud or flashy, just a hard-working man who kept to himself. His wife, Jenna, was the opposite in many ways. She lit up any room she walked into. As a nurse at the local clinic, she was warm, attentive, and always smiling. People said she was a natural caretaker, someone who made you feel better just by being near her. She and Brian had met in high school, fallen in love slowly but surely, and had been together ever since. To the town, they were the perfect couple. But the truth was far more complicated. 17 years of marriage is a long time, especially when both people change without realizing it. Brian had grown quieter over the years, his long work days leaving him exhausted. He'd come home to a house that felt colder than it used to, where conversations turned into routines and kisses became quick pecks on the cheek. He didn't ask questions when Jenna started working late more often. He believed her when she said the clinic was short-staffed, and when she came home smelling like different perfume or with a new dress she hadn't mentioned buying, he convinced himself it didn't mean anything. The truth was, Brian didn't want to see it. He loved her, and that love made him blind to the growing distance between them. Jenna, on the other hand, had begun to drift in ways even she didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the routine of life that pushed her away, or maybe it was the feeling of being unseen. Whatever the reason, she stopped sharing her thoughts with Brian, stopped waiting up for him, stopped feeling anything when he touched her hand. The signs were there, but Brian chose not to look. Not until a small, nagging doubt began to grow in the back of his mind. Like a splinter he couldn't reach. One night Jenna left for what she said was an overnight shift. Brian sat in the dark living room long after she'd gone, staring at the television but not watching anything. The house was too quiet. Her absence felt too long. He walked into their bedroom and noticed her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She never left her phone behind. That's when he saw it. A message from someone named Jim. It read, "Same place tonight?" Brian froze. Jenna hadn't worked out in over a year. He remembered because she had canceled her gym membership after saying it wasn't worth the money. His heart started to pound. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but something deep inside him shifted. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal, or the fact that he didn't see it coming. That night, everything began to unravel. The quiet town, the perfect marriage, the kind husband and the smiling nurse. None of it was real anymore. What had felt like a life built on love now felt like a lie built on habit. And Brian, the man who never raised his voice or lost his temper, began to change. Not suddenly, but slowly, like oil leaking under a truck drop by drop until the engine seizes and everything breaks. Brian couldn't sleep after reading that message. His mind spun with questions, none of which had answers that brought comfort. He told himself it was probably innocent. Maybe it was the gym, maybe it was a friend, maybe he was just being paranoid. But even as he tried to convince himself, A different part of him had already decided to find out the truth. The next evening he installed a phone tracking app. He had never done anything like it before. It felt wrong, sneaky, but the doubt in his heart was louder than his conscience. He needed to know. Once the app was running, he saw her location update in real time. She wasn't at the clinic. She hadn't been for days. Her nightly shifts were lies. The first time he followed her, he didn't plan it. He just saw her location move across the map and decided to drive. His hands shook on the wheel and his stomach felt tight the entire way. He kept far behind, turning off his headlights whenever she slowed. She drove out of Hillside, past familiar roads, and into a stretch of highway surrounded by nothing but dark fields and silence. Then she turned onto a dirt road, one he didn't recognize. He parked a good distance away and walked quietly through the tall grass. What he saw crushed him. Jenna stood next to a car. A man got out and kissed her. They laughed. She rested her head on his chest, and they talked as if they were alone in the world. Brian recognized the man immediately, Darren Myers. He was a real estate agent in Hillside, married, with 2 kids, and a reputation for charm. Brian had even worked on Darren's truck a few times. They weren't close, but they were friendly. That made it worse. Brian didn't say anything. He didn't shout or confront them. He simply turned around and walked back to his truck, his heart like a stone. He didn't drive home right away. He sat in the driver's seat for over an hour, staring through the windshield, numb. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared, replaying the scene in his head over and over again, as if trying to change the outcome through sheer will. The next morning, Jenna came home like nothing had happened. She made coffee, kissed him lightly, and told him she was exhausted. Brian nodded and didn't say a word. That was when something inside him began to shift from pain to purpose. He couldn't stop thinking about the way they laughed together. How comfortable they looked, like it wasn't new. Like it had been going on for a long time. He started following her more often. He kept track of where she went, what time she left, how long she stayed. He took photos from his phone, grainy, distant shots of their meetings behind the old gas station. He recorded video clips, took notes, marked dates. There was no plan at first, just a need to document everything. Proof, maybe, or closure. But the more he saw, the colder he became. Brian stopped talking to friends. He stopped going to church. He ate in silence and worked longer hours, not because he needed the money, but because it gave him something to focus on. Something other than the burning betrayal he carried every second of the day. He couldn't understand how Jenna had changed so much. Or maybe he hadn't changed enough. Maybe she got bored of him. His quiet ways, his greasy hands, his simple love. And Darren, he was everything Brian wasn't. Flashy, well-dressed, always talking, always smiling. The kind of man people noticed. But Brian noticed too. He noticed every lie, every late night, every kiss that should have belonged to him. And in the silence of his garage, with only the ticking of a cooling engine for company, he began to feel something heavier than sadness. A storm building in his chest. And storms, once they start, don't simply stop. Brian watched the days slip by as if he were living someone else's life. Each morning he woke up beside the same woman who now felt like a stranger. He made her coffee, smiled when she smiled, and nodded when she gave excuses about the clinic. It was a performance he perfected, pretending not to know where she really went at night. But behind that calm exterior, his mind was drifting further into something dark. By the second month of following her, the secrecy wasn't enough anymore. He needed to get closer. He bought a drone and started recording from above. From a distance, they looked like lovers in a movie, meeting in the same spot behind the old gas station. hidden between trees and broken fences where no one else ever came. Jenna would park first, then Darren. They would sit in their cars for a few minutes before stepping out. The conversations, the touches, the long hugs. It all happened in silence through Brian's lens. It was like watching a life he didn't belong to, a world where he didn't exist. He studied their pattern, memorized it. Tuesdays and Fridays were their favorites. They stayed for about 45 minutes, never longer. He even knew which side of the car Jenna preferred to lean on. Nothing changed, and that consistency began to shape the thoughts forming in Brian's mind. The affair wasn't a mistake, it was routine. It was practiced, and that made it unforgivable. He started spending more time alone in his garage, not fixing anything, just sitting in the cab of his truck, staring out into the dark. The truck had become his place of control, the one thing he still owned that hadn't been touched by betrayal. He cleaned it obsessively, tightened the bolts, checked the tires, adjusted the brakes. It wasn't about maintenance anymore. It was preparation. Then came the Tuesday he couldn't wait anymore. Jenna had kissed him goodbye like always, with a fake yawn and a bag packed for her night shift. Brian waited 15 minutes before grabbing his keys. He didn't bring his phone. He didn't need it anymore. He knew exactly where she was going and exactly what time she'd be there. The difference now was that he wasn't going to park far away. The sky was heavy with clouds as he drove, and the wind howled through the open fields. The road to the old gas station was empty. No headlights in either direction. He turned off the main road and crept down the familiar path, his truck crawling forward like a predator in the tall grass. He saw their cars before they saw him. He killed his headlights and coasted to a stop behind a cluster of trees. He watched them step out, just like they always did. Darren leaned against the hood of his car, and Jenna stood in front of him. They were talking, close, unaware of anything outside their world. Brian's hands rested on the steering wheel. His heart didn't race. His breathing didn't change. Everything was still. He tapped the gas and let the truck roll forward slowly at first, then faster. Gravel crunched under the tires, but by the time they heard it, it was too late. The impact was violent and immediate. Darren was thrown back onto the hood of his own car. Jenna went under the front bumper. The noise echoed through the trees, a dull thud followed by silence. Brian slammed the brakes and stared through the windshield. Both bodies were motionless. The air smelled of oil, dust, and blood. He didn't move for a moment, just looked at them as if trying to decide if he was dreaming. Then he opened the door, stepped out, and looked down at the wreckage he had made. He pulled out his flip phone and called 911. His voice didn't shake. He told them his name, the location, and what had happened. When asked if anyone was injured, he answered with cold certainty, "They're not getting back up." The emergency call was logged at 9:42 p.m. By 10:03, flashing red and blue lights painted the broken-down gas station in harsh colors. The first officer on the scene found Brian standing next to his truck, hands at his sides, looking at the two crumpled bodies with a blank expression. There were no signs of a struggle, no attempt to flee, no alcohol in his breath. Just Brian, silent and still, like a man who had been waiting for something to end. Jenna's body lay partially beneath the front of the truck, her legs twisted at unnatural angles. Darren had been thrown back into the grill of his own car, head cracked open against the windshield. The scene was brutal but clear. Investigators marked tire tracks leading directly into the victims. No signs of swerving, no hesitation. As paramedics confirmed both were dead on arrival, officers cuffed Brian without resistance. He didn't protest, didn't ask questions. He sat quietly in the back of the cruiser, staring out at the trees swaying in the wind, untouched by what had just happened. Back at the station, detectives began piecing together the story. The footage from Brian's drone was found in a hard drive he kept in his garage. His computer held folders filled with photos, time-stamped logs, even maps showing the route his wife took every Tuesday and Friday. What initially looked like a crime of passion began to take on a different shape, something cold and premeditated. During questioning, Brian answered calmly. He admitted to installing the tracking software, to following them for weeks, and to running them down with full intent. He never raised his voice or asked for a lawyer. When asked why he did it, he said he didn't want to be lied to anymore. The town of Hillside was thrown into chaos. Local news outlets reported on the double homicide behind the abandoned station, and word spread quickly. People were shocked. Brian had been known as a quiet, respectful man. Jenna, though now remembered with whispers of infidelity, had been loved by many. Darren's name, already connected to other rumored affairs, stirred less sympathy. Still, no one had expected something so violent to erupt from a man who had spent most of his life fixing broken things. The prosecution built its case around the idea that Brian had planned the murders. They pointed to the drone footage, the surveillance logs, the obsessive tracking, all proof that this wasn't a moment of emotional collapse but a calculated act of revenge. The media called him the Mechanic Killer, a nickname that stuck throughout the trial. But the defense had its own strategy. They argued that Brian had been driven to temporary insanity, that the emotional trauma of discovering his wife's betrayal, especially with a friend, had shattered his sense of self. Expert witnesses testified that his mental state had deteriorated over time, that the buildup of stress, humiliation, and isolation had created a psychological breaking point. It was a classic argument, not a monster, but a broken man. Then came the most unexpected twist. Darren Myers's wife, Monica, came forward during the second week of the trial. She took the stand and revealed she had known about the affair for nearly 6 months. She hadn't said anything publicly, but had confided in Brian during a chance meeting at a hardware store. She claimed she had told him not out of cruelty, but because she believed he deserved the truth. Her testimony added a new layer. Brian hadn't simply discovered the affair on his own. Someone had nudged him toward it. Prosecutors were stunned. The defense seized the opportunity, suggesting that Monica's confession had served as a psychological trigger. Brian, they argued, had been pushed not only by betrayal but by a betrayal revealed deliberately. Still, no one disputed the facts. Brian had followed them. Brian had waited. And Brian had killed them. The only question left was whether it was murder in cold blood, or a man's mind finally snapping under the weight of his shattered life. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Each day, the courtroom filled with a mix of locals, reporters, and curious strangers drawn in by the story of betrayal and bloodshed in a small Texas town. Brian sat motionless through most of it, dressed in a plain gray suit, his eyes rarely lifting from the table in front of him. He never spoke unless asked. He never looked at the photos shown to the jury. He didn't flinch when the prosecutors described how his truck had crushed the spine of his wife and caved in the skull of her lover. He just listened, calm, detached, like someone watching someone else's life fall apart. The defense team focused on humanizing him. They called character witnesses who described him as gentle, kind, a man who had never so much as raised his voice in public. They brought in a psychologist who spoke about dissociation, stress trauma, and the effects of betrayal on long-term partners. The psychologist claimed Brian hadn't been in full control of himself that night, that the emotional weight of what he'd discovered had warped his thinking, narrowing his world until only one solution seemed clear. But the prosecution didn't budge. They showed the drone footage, the notes, the time-stamped surveillance. They argued that no man who films, documents, and tracks his wife for weeks is in a state of temporary madness. They said Brian Teller didn't break, he calculated. They painted a picture of a man who didn't snap in a moment of rage, but who carefully drove to that gas station with the full intent to kill. It all came down to the jury. 12 men and women who had to decide whether Brian was a grieving husband pushed too far, or a cold-blooded killer who used betrayal as an excuse. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. There was no reaction from Brian. No tears, no anger, no expression at all. He simply stood as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't respond. The town of Hillside was left divided. Some believed justice had been served. Others whispered that Jenna and Darren had brought it on themselves. A few even said they might have done the same in Brian's place, though never out loud. In a place where appearances mattered, no one wanted to admit how many people related to the quiet man who had finally broken. The old gas station was eventually boarded up for good. Jenna and Darren were buried on opposite ends of the town cemetery. Their funerals were days apart, and neither was well attended. Monica Myers moved away with her children and refused all interviews. She never spoke publicly about her role in what had happened. Brian was transferred to a state penitentiary hundreds of miles away. He never appealed his sentence. In prison, he kept to himself just as he had in life. He worked in the laundry, read books, and never caused trouble. A model inmate, the guards said. One who rarely spoke but never forgot names. The story became a cautionary tale in Hillside, the kind people shared in hushed voices late at night. A story about how even the quietest man could carry a storm inside him. How betrayal could be more dangerous than hatred. And how sometimes the deadliest crimes don't come from strangers, but from someone who once loved you enough to build a life with you. Years later, someone carved words into the wood of the old gas station wall, long after the town had stopped talking about what happened there. No one knew who wrote them or when. It said simply, "He didn't lose his mind. He lost his reason to hold it together."